Hello and welcome to the next episode on the podcast. Today we're joined by Lead Academy Doctor at Millwall, Andrew Shafik. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. You're looking very professional with your microphone set up there. You're putting me to shame.
It's just, this is from the podcast. So thanks to the FMPA for supplying this.
Very good. So I'm really intrigued to know, what's your background? So where did you start? I can detect the Scottish accent, but tell me where you originate from.
Yeah, so this is always an interesting question with an interesting answer. So I'm originally Egyptian. Family moved to the UK around the age of when I was around 4. We kind of started in England, shall I say, and migrated up the country. So by the age of 8, we were in the northeast of England, and around 8 years old, we moved to Scotland, and that's kind of where I spent the bulk of my childhood, shall we say, in the Scottish borders, in a really big rugby town actually called Melrose. So even though football was kind of my go-to sport, I was brought up in a very big rugby area where Rugby Sevens was founded in Melrose. After that, I went to medical school in Aberdeen. So I spent 6 years there, did 5 years of medical school, a year intercalating in sport and exercise science. And it was really during that journey, I suppose, that I identified what I was interested in, where I wanted my career direction to go, or where my aspirations lay. So I'd probably say it was about the third year of medical school, really. I remember kind of studying for exams, and I'll be perfectly honest, really lacking motivation for exams, and not really sure where things were going, probably starting to identify that a lot of what I was studying wasn't really my core root interest. And I felt, this is probably more a rite of passage, but trying to identify what it was I was interested in. And it was at that point that I realized SEM was the route, and that's kind of got its own whole story, which I'm sure we'll delve into a little bit deeper.
Right. And so, so how did that desire for that? So you mentioned about football and rugby. What was it that was actually driving you towards that? Was it that you were playing those sports?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. It goes back a long time. I remember even being about 9 years old, 10 years old. I think it was around 2002, 2003 when David Beckham broke his metatarsal against Deportivo La Coruña, and that just always stuck with me. And I was, this was when I was still at school. I think I was still even at primary school potentially at this point. And I just remember being fascinated by it and reading up about it and the bones he broke. And then I started to look into a little bit about, bones in the foot. Not really understanding what I'm reading, but just trying to learn a couple of words here and there, and just found that really, really interesting. And then throughout, obviously, I didn't really know I wanted to do medicine earlier on growing up. Both my parents were doctors. My mum decided to take a slightly different route, actually, when we moved to the UK. So she's gone down counselling route. Medicine wasn't really for her. And I was almost kind of forced away from it by my parents. And I was against it for a long time and felt science was just where I was interested in. But as I say, once I got to medical school, during third year, when I lacked that motivation, I started to realise I'd already applied to kind of study sport and exercise science. So I was taking a year out between the third and fourth year of medical school. And I knew I needed that time. And the reason I did that was because I was interested in sport and exercise science, not because I was trying to get away from medicine, really. It was more that was my interest to that point. And I started to do a bit of research into it. And, I always knew I was interested in injuries, especially, I say football being the primary sport, but in all sports, I was always really interested in the injury side of it. So I started to do a little bit of research in that year and learn a bit more about sport and exercise medicine. So we're probably talking about 2014, 2015, this would be about 2015 for me. And I think quickly you find various things online. You find BASM, the Faculty of Sport and Exercise Medicine, BGSM, and I just started to read more and more and more, speaking to different people. And realized, there's a couple of things I need to do here. I need to go out and get some clinical experiences in these areas and see if that's actually what I'm interested in. And that was kind of the next step. And I also realized that I really liked the education side of it. And in Aberdeen, we didn't have an undergraduate society. So I spoke to a colleague of mine at Robert Gordon University, and myself, one of my friends, and a Robert Gordon University colleague, and we set up a society between the two universities, which was our undergrad society. And the reason we did it like that was because Robert Gordon had physiotherapy, they had sports science, they had a lot of these courses. In Aberdeen, we only had medicine. And I thought, from an MDT point of view, even from research online, I could gather straight away that this was this was an interdisciplinary specialty really, and you needed those different elements.
And how beneficial was doing that sports science for that period of time?
So it was brilliant, to be honest. I think from probably reaping the rewards of that a little bit more now in a performance setting. I think during the last 2 years of medical school, I probably didn't really see the benefits of that as such. But once you're in a performance environment, it gives you a real understanding for, you know, what the various areas of sports science do. And sport and exercise science has got all its kind of different domains, a bit like sport and exercise medicine. But I think it gives you an appreciation for the role of what these members of the team do and how you can liaise with them from docs, from physios as well. And I think it's really important to have an understanding of their roles as well as them having an understanding of your role. So I think it's critical for a performance environment. Maybe not something that's related so much to the National Health Service, slightly different setting really. But I think that's when you start to notice it a little bit more.
And so within that year then, were you, like you say, sports science is a huge area. Were there particular things that you could choose, or was it a set course? How did that work?
Yeah, so the Aberdeen course was relatively set, to be honest. So a lot of the areas of interest for me were probably more from an extracurricular point of view. So for the society, that was kind of the extra bits that we were doing. The course was quite set, you know, going through the various domains, but you had obviously the thesis project, which you were able to, you know, angle in whatever way you wanted. And it didn't actually have to be sport and exercise science related. So it could just be science related. So my dissertation was kind of very unrelated, probably a little bit more related to SEM. So I was quite interested in anatomy as well. So I did a project relating to anatomy education within undergraduate medicine. Interestingly enough, I made a website at the time, which I've totally forgot about until I started to realize I'd done a lot of MSK stuff on this website and started to use it for studying for my exams in the last, you know, month or so. So it's interesting that things come back around in a strange way, but I spent all this time making this website purely, you know, to give students questionnaires to review it and compare it to the tools that they had out there to study for their anatomy. So that was kind of the sports science course side of it. But the extracurricular stuff is really where I started to pick up on things. It was more, you know, speaking to people, seeing what they've got in place. And this isn't just speaking to people at, you know, you don't want to be in a way speaking to people at top clubs, because I was playing for the university first team. We don't have the facilities that, you know, that a Premier League team's going to have, by no means. So it was working on little things. You know, I started to worked with the coach, with the university committee, which I was on, to try and get in a physio, which I thought would kind of take us to the next step. Thought it'd be useful, you know, for a Robert Gordon University physio. Also kind of utilising what we had with the society to get in a physio. We started to try and get some sports science input as well. There was talk of potentially trying to get some performance analysis input due to the setup up in Aberdeen with kind of the Scottish Rugby Union up there. So I was trying to utilise some of the stuff I was seeing elsewhere to see, right, can you bring this into areas that I'm involved in otherwise. And yeah, just attending events. Every day I was kind of learning new things. It was really interesting. I was probably learning more from the extracurricular stuff than I was from my university degree when I went back into medicine. But I think that's just because you engulf yourself in your areas of interest a little bit more. And we put on kind of in the first year 3 or 4 talks. And that was kind of where it really started to take off, and one thing led to another there.
That's interesting. So go back to that website then. So how did that come about? What made you want to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, anatomy was another area of interest. It was probably the thing that I was enjoying most in the medical course. And there was an anatomy intercalated degree at the uni, and I opted for sport and exercise science, but I really found the anatomy side interesting. So I kind of, when they opened up the floor as such, I always had in the back of my mind, you know, once I did the reading in that year and I started to realize, right, SEM is, I think, a route I'm interested in. Once I gained clinical experience, which I'll speak about in a moment, I realized, you know what, I'm probably going to go down the SEM route, but I really find, you know, I identified MSK as such a big part, and I wanted to kind of engulf myself in the anatomy and the knowledge of it. And it's something I think in medical school that's not taught as well as it could be, depending on where you study. I think medical school is an interesting one. I'm a big believer that I think the medical school you go to has a big influence sometimes in what career you decide to do. my girlfriend's got an oncology interest and she studied at Newcastle, and quite a lot of her colleagues have an oncology interest. And I don't think that's by fluke personally. When you speak to them, I think they had a couple of big lecturers in the field of cancer, and that's what's made them really interested in that area. For me, it was a bit different, but I think once I identified sport was the area I was interested in, I realised, Aberdeen's got an absolute gulf of previous people that were similarly interested in the area. So you've got Andrew Murray, CMO of the European Tour, who's been an absolutely fantastic mentor for me. And he came to speak for the society in our first year actually, and was brilliant. John Hanson, who's worked with the FA, Scottish Rugby Union, Glasgow Warriors doctor. He big influence in the APMIF courses and Scrum Caps courses. So in pitch side immediate care with his A&E background and his SEM background. Jeff Cullen. So there's lots of different. I think there's an influence there, and I think university influences you in a certain way. But for me, I found anatomy so interesting, but probably because we weren't getting what I felt was what I knew I'd be interested in the future, if that makes sense. So slightly different element maybe to my girlfriend and their oncology lecturers. But yeah, I think it's, I think that was a big part of me wanting to kick on and do SEM, was a bit of the MSK interest, certainly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I was chatting with Lorenzo Maschi about this, and that his interest in tendons, exactly that, was coming across the people like Jill Cook, Hawken Alfredson, and so on. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You are dictated by the people you associate with and who you come across. So at what point then, so you decided that SEM is something that you're really interested in. Did you have a vision of where you wanted to get to? I mean, you're probably still visualizing that now to some extent, but at that point, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so as I say, so during, between that third and fourth year when I did sports science, I thought I need to get some experience. I went out and I spoke to Gurj Bogal, who is an SEM consultant in the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham. So that's where my family are actually based now. And I decided to spend 4 or 5 weeks of my summer before going back into medicine, doing a placement with him. It was roughly 3 days a week. And he was great, to be honest. He was willing to kind of take me on in that setting. And I had no real experience at that point. So all I'd done at that point was getting the society up and running, doing the sport and exercise science degree, and speaking to people and attending a few conferences. So during that year, I'd been to the Arsenal conference, which was brilliant, and I'd been to a couple others. And that was kind of my first taste of it, shall we say. And in that, it was a real range. So, I attended MSK clinics, MDT clinics with physios, docs, whole range of people. There were sports injury clinics there as well. And there was something called a functional restoration program. And that was kind of the first time I'd ever seen exercise medicine in practice. And it was a 4-week program where they would recruit certain individuals with chronic pain. And it was a mix of kind of utilizing education, so educating them about obviously pain, the basic physiology of pain, educating them about analgesia and how opioids are not really beneficial for the chronic pain as such, educating them about lifestyle and exercise. And there was docs, there was physios, there was psychotherapists, there was a right mix of an MDT. And what I started to quickly realize was, if the correct people were recruited into this 4-week program twice a week, the results were absolutely fascinating. There was people, that were on opioids for 10 to 15 years. They couldn't walk more than a kilometre. And in the space of 4 weeks, you were seeing them completely weaned down from medication, doing basic exercises like sitting from standing in a chair, able to go on like a 2-kilometre jog. And a lot of it was that MDT focus, and as well, recruiting the right people to get the buy-in. And it wasn't, what was going on wasn't rocket science. It was just the structure was there, and it was a fantastic service that was implemented in a really, in a really good way, to be honest with you. And I remember actually sitting in a session. This is one of the things that stands to me, was sitting in a session that was talking about the, basic physiology, trying to explain about sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system and how you get your pain. I remember one patient who would always get her pain. She'd get back pain when she was in the car. And her trigger was when she was a passenger. So she wasn't the driver, she was always the passenger. And it was quickly identified that about 10 to 15 years before, she was involved in a car crash where she was a passenger. and she had kind of whiplash type injury. And after that, she just developed chronic back pain. But any day that she'd get into the car, that would be enough to bring on her back pain, but it wouldn't come on when she was the driver because she felt she was in control. And it was all really subconscious to her. And during the program, she had incredible results. And started to exercise. She weaned down her medication. They were teaching her about, you need to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, using things like mindfulness when you see that your pain's going to come on, deep breathing techniques, trying to dissociate from the things that are making you go into that fight or flight and getting your adrenaline pumping. And that was a real fascinating part. The first time I'd seen exercise medicine practice, as I say, and I was lucky to also get a couple of opportunities within elite sport, just to shadow in a cricket environment and in a elite football environment, just to go in and see what it was like. It wasn't, a matter of meeting players, meeting other members of the MDT. It was going into an elite football environment with the doc and just having a look at the facilities that are available and being able to ask questions and understanding their rules a little bit more. So that 4 to 5 weeks, even though it was out my summer, where friends were traveling, that was where I really learned, okay, this is the basics of exercise medicine in practice, the basics of MSK and sports injury and what it looks like in an NHS setting, and the basis of team event medicine, shall we say, and what's available out there. And similar to probably a lot of people who, like myself, are interested in sport and exercise medicine, I think one of the things that always pulls you initially is the sport. People always find the sport bit is the attractive bit, it's the sexy bit, shall we say. But quite quickly, once they learn a bit more about exercise medicine, I think they find it fascinating. It has its frustrations for sure, but definitely fascinating. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but I hope it...
No, it's really interesting. So when was that then that you were part of that kind of multidisciplinary team? Because I find that mindfulness side is so massive at the moment, isn't it? But it's becoming more mainstream. But when was that you were looking at that?
Yeah, so that would have been 2015, maybe 2016. So at that stage, it was probably, I think it was the end of my sports science degree. As I say, I'd been to a couple of conferences, spoken to a couple of people, and we'd got the society up and running. I don't even think we'd ran any events at that point. And then that's where I organised that placement, and that was my first clinical experience of SEM.
And so in terms of that mindfulness aspect, how do you see that being implemented within the NHS but through to elite sport as well? What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I think there's things that are coming into play a lot more in both settings. I mean, in an elite sports setting, you're seeing a lot more kind of athletes posting about themselves doing yoga, involved in Pilates, not only from the benefits from a physical point of view, but I think also the mental health point of view and the relaxation and getting them into a different zone and implementing that onto the pitch or whatever their sport may be. So I think there's definitely an element of that, and sports psychology's got it's a huge gap there, really. And it's interesting, the more podcasts you listen to nowadays with elite athletes, I think at some point sports psychologists kind of mentioned with all them. I was listening to high performance podcasts with Tyrone Mings, all these people, and they always tap into that a little bit and explain that it's a big part of their preparation and their mentality, really, which is we know is just as big as the physical aspects of the game. In the NHS, I think that clinic was brilliant. As I say, that's implemented at its best. As I say, Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham, I'd highly recommend, if difficult with COVID times, but from a shadowing point of view, I'd recommend anyone that has an interest in it to go and shadow it. I think it's got a huge area. I think exercise medicine's got a massive area within the NHS, and that will definitely be something that will come into play more and more and more. I think now with COVID, especially where we're seeing long COVID, there's certain clinics being set up for long COVID. And we know that certain people are more susceptible to, chronic pain. Certain people are more susceptible to certain things after certain conditions, and they trying to treat post-viral syndromes as such, which is essentially what long COVID is. I think exercise medicine will have a big part to play in that, and that taps into the different aspects of the psychological as well as the physical. So I think there definitely is an area. It's going to grow. It's definitely going to grow within the NHS, and I think it's going to be the core area of growth for SEM within the NHS. So it's probably somewhere that we need to watch the space and see what comes of it.
So where do you see your role? Where do you want to be involved in? Do you want to be involved in across the whole range? You're working with Millwall at the moment and doing other things as well. But have you got an interest in the NHS and developing things there too?
Yeah, so at the moment I've applied for GP training, so to start in August time. So the plan is to see what happens with that. I think within long term, I've got an interest within the NHS in a GP setting, but also like the elite sports setting. So I think there's definitely twofold there. And it's one of these things that you know, elite sports, one of these areas that you have to see what comes your way. Really, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to plan. I've got an interest in education, a big interest in education. That's kind of one of the reasons that, you know, I've gotten more involved with the FMPA type stuff. And, you know, I'd love, I think, in future to be involved within teaching, within masters, whether it's trying to implement a program or whether it's being involved in a current program and trying to link that into a potential clinical role, bringing students in that have similar interests to where I would have been at that stage. And I think education is brilliant because you know, you learn all the time. I mean, for me, when people ask me about the podcast, I just say, you know, I'm sitting having a chat with someone, I'm meeting them and I'm learning from them. It's free education, it's face to face, I'm networking, I'm meeting someone. But you know, what's the negative? I don't really know what the negative is, because you know, you spend your time on other things. So that's, you know, there's constant benefits from that, and you do learn from lots of different people and lots of different fields, even, you know, conversations like this. So I think long term I'd like to be potentially involved in a mix. It's one of these things, I think you have to see what comes your way. Football medicine and performance is a big interest of mine. So I'm enjoying what I'm involved with at the moment, but just have to see what happens as you know, as time goes on.
Yeah. So how did that roll with this? So it's Football Medicine and Performance Association is the organisation, but how did that come about?
Yeah, so during my foundation year 2, so the second year of, I was a junior doctor in Newcastle. So after Aberdeen, I went to Newcastle, did my junior years there. And I did some kind of clinical shadowing with Gateshead, who were in the National League. Unfortunately, actually, after that year, they got relegated, not because of points, but because of administrative issues. And that was great because the facilities there were totally different to other areas of elite football I'd seen. So I used to shadow at Aberdeen under-20s with Greg Nichol, who's a colleague of mine. And then went on to doing something similar at Gateshead with very different facilities. And then also the following year did something similar at Newcastle, again, all shadowing, just trying to learn from docs, physios. Obviously Newcastle United Academy under-23s, under-18s was totally different to Gateshead. And then I got in touch with, so Andrew Murray, I mentioned, was one of my, you know, and still is a fantastic mentor for me. And he kind of advised I get in touch with a colleague within football medicine who would cross paths previously, called Sean Carmody. And Sean was involved with the FMPA at the time. He was editing the editorial, and he was kind of creating an editorial team or an education team as such to edit this magazine that was released quarterly to healthcare professionals working within the game. And he asked if I'd like to be involved. So I started reviewing some articles with Sean. And really that's kind of where things took off, and we developed the podcast alongside the editorial. And the editorial, I mean, there's a lot of work that's put into the editorial just now. We're trying to reshuffle things around, and I'm helping on a more kind of senior level with Sean and another colleague called Ferry Hassan in the Midlands. But it was more trying to fight, you know, the target market's very much in between a blog, shall we say, and a peer-reviewed journal type articles. So it's good, real good quality, real good value to football medicine performance community. And there's not something that's really the exact same as what we do. And then the podcasts were to kind of supplement that or align that or slightly different for that, for maybe a slightly different target market who don't have the time to read articles and articles. So that's kind of how the FMPA stuff came about. And as I say, similar to many other people, these things kind of, you start one thing and, you know, ideas come from it and it grows legs, and that's kind of what happened with that.
Are there any particular things that have really resonated with the people that you've interviewed on there? I know I'm sure lots of them have been good, but is there any 2 or 3 things that you just thought that absolutely stuck with me?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about that when you asked that, the first one that comes to memory, I think, is when I spoke to Johnny Gordon, the Scotland national team doctor. Johnny's absolutely fantastic. He's an A&E background alongside the SEM, well, the elite football stuff that he does, and he kind of consults with FIFA. And he told the story, which I think really shows the difficulties of working elite football, about Andy Massey when when Liverpool, they were 3-0 down from the first leg against Barcelona at the weekend. Between the first and the second leg, Mo Salah goes down with a head injury against Newcastle, and we know how serious head injuries are when you're involved in the SEM field, but sometimes I think there's a slightly different perception, shall we say, in the public of the management of head injuries, and there's not a real understanding of the protocols that are in place. And I think after the game, don't quote me on this, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure after the game, I think Jurgen Klopp came out and said, that Salah would be available for the next game. And for those involved in SEM, we know that wouldn't be the case, because for him to follow the protocol, he wouldn't be available to play on the following Tuesday. So I think it was a Wednesday against Barcelona, the Saturday against Newcastle where he picked up the injury, and he wouldn't be available for the Tuesday in the second leg, and obviously 3-0 down at Anfield. And we know Andy Massey there, stuck to the head injury protocols really in the toughest of times. So it's something I think that really resonates, because you hear of people working at various levels that explain how difficult it is to manage head injuries, which can be totally correct, but that's a real high pressure situation. One of the best players in the world at that time, well, arguably still one of the best players in the world, although I could be biased with the Egypt link, about to play Barcelona in the second leg, and I think that's that one really, really, really resonates. That's probably one of the stories I think it's a real fascinating story to always tell, and head injuries is something that's constantly topical in SEM at the moment. But yeah, I think we've had lots of brilliant speakers, docs, physios, sports scientists, a whole real range. Will Abbott talking about research at Brighton and the stuff that they're using and implementing, really fascinating as well. John Hansen, as I say, who I've already mentioned, talking about that he went along with the England team on a couple of tournaments as their second doctor, but also as like a head injury lead. So again, taps into that area as such. Yeah, we've had plenty of great speakers. Karen Carney, I think she was absolutely fascinating on the podcast. I think Karen's fascinating as it is, listening to her on BT Sport, but their punditry, and she had a really, really successful footballing career. But she really opened up about, the mental health side of stuff, her mental health during her own individual career, and the influence of medicine and performance staff around her, as well as, what she's doing now and some of the work she's doing alongside Visa and the Visa program of, trying to look at outside football, trying to provide education, work experience for women's players that, for looking after their career. So post career and where they could go. Really, really fascinating. Yeah, we've had great speakers, Vincent, Liam, and we recently interviewed Paul from involved with Leicester City, works with the Swedish team as well. And again, a real fascinating talk about performance analysis and everything in the, I think in elite sport is geared to optimize performance, but all these speakers kind of explain to you that it's that same end goal, but from different angles, depending on their role and depending on the model that's in place in their clubs or their teams. So I recommend all the speakers really.
Yeah, no, I know it's always difficult to pick out specific things, but no, that fascinated me one about Barcelona, because obviously it worked out in the end. So I'm sure you took credit for the selection that was enforced.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you've done a diploma in sports medicine with FIFA. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so that was kind of the reason it motivated me personally to do that was when I did that first clinical experience back in 2015, 2016. I was recommended, I was kind of signposted towards it. It's absolutely fascinating. I think it's 42 modules, completely free. It's so, fantastic detail. Real credit to FIFA for putting it together, leaders within the area, and it's more specific towards football, medicine and performance, but kind of covers the key topics in sports medicine as a whole. So it's split into, I think, lower limb, upper limb, as well as covering spine target groups, and then looking at certain other areas of the game, such as, travel medicine, the, sudden cardiac arrest, all these type of things. It's, I'd highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's totally free, available online. And I think a real credit, probably as good as I've seen for a resource that is free online. It's one of the first things when people always ask, where can they go with SEM? I always recommend it because I think it's, for a free resource, it's absolutely brilliant. A real credit to FIFA for producing it.
Oh, right, I didn't know it was a free resource on there as well. So how did the role at Millwall happen?
So yeah, that was an opportunity that came up as I was basically moving to London. So literally, I was already moving to London during that period, and that was, timed well for me. It was a job that was advertised on the FMPA. I applied, was lucky to interview and get the role. It was a really good team over at Millwall. Lucky to work with them, with the sports scientists, the physios, the various members of the MDT there, and I've learned an awful lot from them. But the opportunity, as I say, was kind of advertised online, and just was good timing. I was lucky to be successful and get the role.
And how have you found managing your work? Like, how often are you in there? Like, how has COVID affected, like, how often you can be in there? How has that all happened?
Yeah, so a lot of the team there are full time. So there's a full time physiotherapist, the head of the medicine and the science department, the sports scientists, and they focus. The under 18s have their own physiotherapist, under 23s have their own physiotherapist, and there's the head of medicine and science that sits over them. And then there's the own individual performance analysis and sports scientists associated with that. There's all their members that are part time as well. So my role is mainly covering the under 18s, under 16 matches, and reviewing any necessary players, whether that may be at the moment remotely via Zoom, whether that's pre or post match. But a lot of it is to do with the pitch side immediate care for the under 16 and under 18 home matches, which one of the requirements is having a doc at that level at Category 1, Category 2 clubs. With COVID, football and football medicine's changed. I think the PPE being one of the big things. So the PPE that we have pitch sides, docs always had gloves on, but now there's the addition of the masks and the other parts of the personal protective equipment. There's lots of protocols in place to make things safe. So even for the players, pre-match, they can't get changed in changing rooms at times anymore. So they've got to turn up ready for games, which is a bit more difficult now when times are colder outside. So you're asking these players to come in their kit, essentially warm up, play a match, and leave straight away. And if they need assessed, if we need to assess them indoors, then it's, having a mask on in place, social distancing measures, as well as, having hand gels pretty much everywhere. Similar stuff to what's kind of going on within all other sports and within all other areas of work, but adapted to the game. This week, there's the introduction of lateral flow testing. So under 18s, under 16s are getting 2 lateral flow tests weekly at that level to be allowed to continue. So academy football from under 15 and below is closed across the country, with the country being in lockdown. Under 18s, under 23s has continued under the guidance that they have lateral flow testing twice a week, and the under 16s have some level of involvement. So it's a bit different to what they used to previously, but still some level of involvement with testing. So that's kind of had its own challenges as well. So I think COVID's been, I say COVID's been fascinating. I don't know if people will agree, but it's definitely presented its challenges to everyone in whatever field they're involved with. And it's continually, we're learning more about the virus, and therefore things are continually changing, as well as the numbers are changing. Unfortunately, the death rates, are kind of increasing at times as well. So the country's continually changing from governmental level, and the advice that we're given. And I think sport has just had to kind of, sit, watch, let the rest of other fields and adapt as appropriate. So that's had its challenges, but I think everyone that's been involved at any level with COVID implementation or whatever area of work, they've certainly learned an awful lot, and will be better for it, hopefully, in the long term.
Do you think there's any things that you will take away that you will think actually that is actually a way better way of managing things, that you would hopefully, when we go back to as normal as possible?
Yes, I think, from a sport exercise medicine, I think prevention is a big part of the specialty. I've been lucky to shadow a little bit with the European tour with Andrew Murray I mentioned, and they carried out a lot of fantastic work, but way pre-COVID times, about infection prevention control. Having Andrew's also involved with European athletics, so he kind of implements the work across the board. but having infographics in toilets, not just for athletes but for spectators, about washing hands, attractive images to explain to them the importance of it. I think the stats, which I won't share, are sometimes a bit baffling actually, about the number of people that don't wash hands after they've been to the toilet, for men and women. I think the pandemic has certainly changed that. I mean, I see that from an NHS setting, from the A&E work I do now, where patients ask if they can wash their hands before they leave the room. Some ask for a pair of gloves until they get home. You would never be asked for that pre-COVID times. But as I say, yeah, the European Tour had implemented a lot of that work prior, and reaped the benefits for it. As well, I think the organisation side of stuff, seeing how quickly, I think, the NHS has had the government's had its criticism. The NHS maybe at times has had its criticism during this pandemic. But I think for me, seeing how quickly the different environments have adapted is fascinating. I mean, I still do A&E shifts, and I go in one week and I get told ITU's at a certain capacity. I go in the following week and it's 1.5 times the capacity it was. It's absolutely crazy. And you were hearing at the start that we're struggling for various pieces of equipment, but the adaptation has been incredible. And I think it's been the same in every field. So I think that's something, it's definitely built resilience. I think the infection prevention control is something that will continue long term. It'll have more of a stress than ever. It'll be interesting to see, obviously, how long certain other things continue, like mandatory face masks as such. But it's watch this space really about what I mean. We're still currently in the pandemic. What will continue after will be interesting. But I think the infection prevention control side of it in sport will be huge, and that'll be an integral part now, not just for COVID, but gastroenteritis, all these types of infections when you're traveling. So there was a bit of work into that, but it's only going to get bigger.
And why do you think the golf were ahead of the game? What was their thought process behind that?
That's an interesting question. I think golf is a fascinating sport in the sense of you've continually got people from all over the world coming to a venue to be involved. I think that presents a lot of challenges during the COVID times for ensuring appropriate testing when people are in their own countries, as well as flying over to come to the venue, as well as remaining in a certain bubble. So I think because of that, prevention has been absolutely massive in that field, probably more so than other sports, that are involved at domestic level with traveling, once every 2-3 weeks to play in European football, if that's the case. So I think that's, for me, I mean, this is more of a guess than anything. I'm sure Andrew would be the best person to answer this question, but I think that's why they looked into that. I know other sports definitely have looked into it, but I think that's why in golf it was taken to that kind of next level, quite early doors, because of the nature of the game and where the athletes are coming from.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. So in terms of that, you've worked in a number of different sports. How much have you learned from working with golf, football, rugby, all of these things? How beneficial is that from working with a cross-section of both medical professionals but also athletes?
I think it's vital, to be honest. I think you, as I mentioned earlier, you pick up different things from different areas. I was lucky. I spent some time with the golf at the British Masters this year, so that was kind of, they were. It was July time, am I right in saying? I think it was end of July, mid-July, and seeing the protocols that were put in place there to return. Again, it comes back to COVID. I think a lot of things do now, but seeing what they'd put in place, the protocols, the liaising with public health. So speaking to, public health or certain areas that they're traveling to. So say, for example, the Masters being in Newcastle, making sure they're communicating appropriately with the public health authorities there to ensure that they can put on this event, ensuring that they've got that tight bubble, the communication with the hotels to ensure that they've got exclusive access, which is key to maintain that bubble environment, the various challenges that arise with that. So meals to rooms, whatever it may be, transport, ideally individual bubbles within that big bubble. So whether it's player and caddy only allowed in a vehicle together, all these little different things. And I think the more time you spend in different areas, the more you see how things are done slightly differently, because they need to be done differently in different sports. As I said, golf, you've got athletes from all over the world, so they're getting tested before they fly as well as when they arrive. So I think you learn about protocol. I don't personally have an interest in golf I've never played golf, watch little bits, but I wouldn't say I'm a golf fan. Certainly by no means know anything, no sufficient amount of that sport, but I've learned an awful lot about the organisation and medical protocols that are put in place, more so post COVID, from a sport like golf. Athletics, for example, again, a slightly different challenges. You see different injuries, you see different illnesses because of the various things that are related to maybe football, rugby. And rugby, you see lots of concussion, and the more time you spend, you see more, not lots of concussion, I'll say more concussion than you maybe do in other sports. And I think the more time you spend in these areas, when you're faced with a situation in the field that you're in, the more likely you're able to deal with it. I think that's the key there of trying to gain experience in the various areas. So that's not just, it's not really just, it's different sports, youth sport, adult sport, women's sport, disability sport. I don't actually personally have any experience in disability sport, but tackling all these different things is only going to make you a better clinician. Yeah, no, absolutely, makes total sense. And in terms of consuming data and consuming CPD, how have you found doing that? So there's loads of online things that we see that are popping up that's had to replace the physical in-person courses. How have you found that? I think that, as you mentioned, there's been a lot that's been released. Again, that's another adaptation post-COVID, that there's been, everyone's adapted to putting on online webinars, replacing their conferences with online conferences. It's had its pros and cons in the sense of, you can access people from all around the world. You can now get speakers from Australia, the US, wherever it may be, which you wouldn't have been able to previously. But the biggest con, you slightly lose that networking element of face-to-face and having a coffee with someone, at a conference in between in a break. So it's been really fascinating. I think there's lots and lots out there. And initially there was, probably similar to many people, I would see something and sign up straight away. You were signing up to most things. I think after that, you need to identify what you require, what your development goals are, and that's probably what I tried to do a little bit, and just see what maybe ticks these individual boxes. What can I do in the time? Because I think now you could probably spend Monday to Friday just in front of your screen, really doing CPD. So it's trying to identify what benefits you. There's lots of great stuff out there. I'm not going to recommend one over the other, because I think it's very much down to the individual and what their personal development goals are.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's an overload of everything there. So got to make sure it's good, whatever it is you're producing or watching. And in terms of that, you're one of the next generation of doctors. So what do you see the role of social media? And I asked that question for one, again, because Lorenzo was speaking with him. He said he's found Twitter so helpful because he's got loads of data. He's seen papers via that through Twitter. How do you see the role of both getting information, but also just the role of it in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think huge. In short, huge. I think when I started to become interested in SEM in that year that I mentioned earlier, Twitter was one of the first things I kind of signed up to. And you've got access to free papers, articles, obviously, highlighting to webinars and things that we've mentioned. I think one of the biggest things are, we know that the future generation are spending a lot more time on their phone. I mean, on devices generally than what the case was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we know the research indicates that people are more likely to look at a visual representation of data rather than written. So if I give you a 10-page article, you're more likely to remember more of it if I gave you a summary in a visual format compared to that 10-page article. Stefan Griffin did a really interesting talk on that at a conference I attended at the FASIC conference in Edinburgh, and I think he actually did a little bit of a thread on his Twitter about it, and I think I'd probably highlight going to that if people have got time. It would have been about September 2019, I think it would have been. And, it completely highlights that. It's got its pros and cons. Again, obviously, reading a 10-page article, you develop critical analysis. You can actually analyze it yourself. You can identify discussion points as such, whereas looking at an infographic, you're just going to get the key messages. However, time saves time. It's more attractive to look at the obvious things. And I think social media has got a key role in disseminating that information, whether it's Twitter, probably more so Twitter in an SEM environment, Facebook, Instagram, all these type of things, seeing little, 20-second snippets of how someone examines a knee, or, someone injecting a knee or whatever it may be. People are more likely to sit and watch that 20 seconds than read a paper as such. I think social media's got a critical role in disseminating the information that's available out there, and signposting to the appropriate areas for people to go and have a further look. And that's kind of what we've tried to do with the FMPA. I know the BGSM's got a huge field in this area, and it's a credit to these things. That's why these pages have 70, 80,000 following them, like the BGSM Twitter, because the work that's been put in by the likes of Stefan to highlight the infographics, the podcasts, the blogs that they're doing, and disseminating the information that they've produced, whether it's the original research article, whether it's a summary or a blog of that, whether it's a visual representation of it.
So how would you do that from a personal level? Like, how often a day do you check Twitter or LinkedIn or any of these platforms?
Yeah, so it depends really. It depends, I suppose, on the day and what the day looks like. I think if it's something that if we're releasing something with the FMPA, we have, for example, a certain structure. I'm sure the BGSM and other platforms are similar, a certain structure that we release, kind of identifying a speaker announcement of a speaker that's coming up, and then releasing the podcast, and then trying to signpost, a week or two or whatever it may be later about the articles that they've mentioned or that are related. And it's good for the speaker because, people can learn a little bit about their work. If speakers are happy, people can contact them and learn from them. So it's got that own little networking side of it. So it's kind of depends on the task at hand, shall I say. Like many, if you've got a free moment, I think you find yourself on your phone sometimes on Twitter. It's something I'm trying to limit personally. I think I'm one of these new generation who probably spends a bit too much time in front of his phone. But yeah, I mean, communication via, if you're not on WhatsApp or Twitter, these things have their benefits, and I suppose it's trying to balance that up. But I think, as we said, Twitter is for me personally in SEM so fantastic from an educational point of view, as well as disseminating content for the various things like the FMPA and webinars that various people are involved in.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting because we can see a massive trend in that area. We're spending a lot more time putting resource into it, so it's good to hear it from your perspective and see. So in terms of you going forward then, what do you see? Do you have a particular vision of where you want to go from here?
So I think it's one of these things that you kind of, as we mentioned earlier, sport, you have to just see what comes your way to some extent. So at the moment, I'm still doing my, the Millwall role and the educational side that we mentioned with the FMPA, reviewing some infographics for the BGSM, and then I'm assistant secretary for the FA Medical Society. So that's kind of trying to put on events, again, educational events. That's the education side of, I suppose, what I do. I mean, I'm not personally educating anyone. It's, again, disseminating, the great content that's out there. It's not my areas of expertise. It's areas I'm trying to learn about from these people individually, but just trying to put the information out there. The plan for the next the short-term plan is GP training, and tackling the obstacles that come with that. Finishing my SEM masters, and hopefully trying to sit my diploma of SEM exams, and then see where things are after a GP training and reassess. There's a really good SEM training program in the UK, and that might be a potential option in future. So just wait and see what happens from a mix of NHS, MSK, and elite sport. And yeah, that's kind of the short-term plan, and see what happens after those obstacles are tackled.
And for anyone who's looking at getting involved in this area of study and then going forward work, what particular advice would that be, both from the clinical aspect of taking on which courses you want to do, but also embracing that social media and I mean, the fact you built a website university shows you are very minded in that electronic side?
Yeah, so I've been asked this question a few times. I think there's a few. I mean, the way I always answer it is trying to tackle all corners. That's kind of always my view on things, is to try and tackle all corners. Certain people have a certain area of interest, a bit like when we're talking about golf and football. There's a reason that you do all these other things, but that's kind of how I've always tried to go about it, because I found benefit in all these individual things and learning from other people. I think for, if you're a student, undergraduate sport and exercise medicine society, so USEM's a really good place to signpost. BASM, the faculty. So if you just type USEMS or BASM or FSEM, and the BGSM, really good, areas to check out for sure. I think for students trying to get clinical experience in the area, so not only in MSK, sports med, or team medicine, shall we say, MSK and exercise medicine, but trying to get experience in those areas. And people have a vision of, they want to shadow at a Premier League club, but trying to get areas at the ground, sometimes you'll learn a lot more at like Gateshead Football Club, for example, because you've got a physio who's got on full time. I remember at the time, they've got a bit of understanding about psychology. They've only got access to a doctor on match day, so they've got to have all these skills and within their arsenal, compared to a Premier League club where they'll have a nutritionist who's specialised in that area. So sometimes you learn more from the ground up. So yeah, trying to get clinical experience, I think, is key. A bit more difficult with COVID times, but there's always opportunities out there. I think it's just trying to find them and hunt them down. Being involved in research, it's not something I'm fantastic at myself, but I think getting involved in some level of research, you learn various skills, whether that's infographics, whether that's being involved in articles, whether that's helping with data collection, again, in these areas, or whether it's an area you're interested in. So that's another thing I would highly recommend tackling. And then CPD and education, whether that's being involved in committees to try and put that on, whether that's assisting others by putting up social media posts for them, because you're in your 20s and you know how to use emojis. It sounds silly, but that's, these things are the things that get clicks and get people interested in signing up. And you'll find that, once you start one thing, opportunities present themselves a lot more. A bit like the exercise medicine stuff that I was saying, I didn't know an awful lot about. And a couple of years later, I was helping University of Aberdeen implement lifestyle teaching within the undergraduate curriculum and get an opportunity to lecture to first year medical students. So these things come about from a root interest and from learning from others. It's never been, it's content that others have produced that's out there, and it's about trying to identify that and identify your learning goals. But yeah, I think research, clinical, teaching, or your own CPD and development, 3 areas that are good to tick off. And I think sometimes when you spot that in your CV, a lot of medical applications will actually ask for these things split up into those areas. So if you're actually tackling that in a field, it's going to benefit you for your applications later on, as well as meeting people along the way.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think that's really good advice. I think it has changed a lot, hasn't it, in the last 10 years in terms of all of that consuming of information. Well, no, great. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Just about afternoon now, but thank you very much for coming on. And yeah, it'd be great to keep in touch. And I'm definitely going to check out some of the podcasts you've had on your platform. So yeah,
definitely. Thank you very much for having me. It's you've had some great speakers. I've listened to a few of these myself. I've actually got the Clint Hill one is next in line for me to listen to, but I was listening to Dr. Robertson's one. A lot more experience, great stories. Wish I had the stories he had for you today, but
yeah, we'll give it a few years and we'll get you back on, and then we can get those out with you.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Andrew. All the best.
Thanks. Cheers. Thanks, now.